evening, everyone. If everyone could take their seats, please, and silence their cell phones, we are going to get started here. Welcome to the Courier-Journal's Forum on Constitutional Amendment 2. I'm Hannah Pinsky, politics reporter at the Courier-Journal and moderator for tonight's discussion. Amendment 2 is a crucial issue that has sparked controversy across Kentucky, which is why we felt it was important to host this event so voters could hear from both sides of the issue and make a more informed decision at the ballot box. The measure was sponsored by Republican Representative Susan Miles of Owensboro and was passed by the General Assembly during this year's legislative session to appear on Kentucky's ballot. The proposed amendment read as follows. To give parents choices and educational opportunities for their children, are you in favor of enabling the General Assembly to provide financial support for the education costs of students in kindergarten through 12th grade who are outside of the system of common/public schools by amending the Constitution of Kentucky as stated below? The General Assembly may provide financial support for the education of students outside the system of common schools. The General Assembly may exercise this authority by law, sections 59, 60, 171, 183, 184, 186, and 189 of this Constitution notwithstanding. Voters will have the opportunity to check yes or no on their general election ballot. Our panelists tonight are William Hoyt, Chair of Public Finance at the University of Kentucky's Martin School of Public Policy and Administration, Maddie Shepard, President of Jefferson County Teachers Association, and Jim Waters, President and CEO of the Bluegrass Institute for Public Policy Solutions. For the first half of the forum, the Courier-Journal has prepared questions ahead of time for our panelists, where each side will get 2 minutes to respond. The second half will be spent asking questions that audience members submitted ahead and during the discussion. You can write your questions on the cards left on your seat, and we will collect them. So we will start by asking some questions to Professor Hoyt, and our first question is, there's been a lot of debate over what Amendment 2 does and doesn't do. What specifically does the amendment do?
Yes, well, first, thank you for inviting me here to talk about this. I'm looking forward to this. What it does, and this is very different from other states. Other states did not go through this constitutional amendment. And the reason is some of the parts of the Constitution cited earlier, we have the following language in the Constitution currently. An efficient system of common schools throughout the state, that's section 183 Hannah mentioned. All funds accruing to the school fund shall be used for the maintenance of public schools of the Commonwealth and for no other purpose. Section 189, no portion of any fund or tax now existing shall be appropriated to or used by in the aid of any church, sectarian, or denominational school. All right, so hence the need for the constitutional amendment to revise those parts.
Thank you. Our second question is, why is the amendment needed, and why can't lawmakers just spend taxpayer money on other educational opportunities besides public schools like they've done in other states?
Well, again, I think that was probably just addressed, is that taxpayer funds of the state cannot go by constitution to anything other than public schools.
If Amendment 2 is passed, based on your knowledge of what's happened in other states, what types of programs could we see in Kentucky? In other words, could you lay out the different school choice options that other states have implemented, Professor?
Yeah, let me kind of go through some of them and give you an indication of what sort of options are. Now, again, this is not a proposal that is specifying any public funding of private schools specifically, but allowing the possibility. So we can sort of think about maybe five different forms: a school voucher, tax credit scholarships, educational savings accounts, tax credits, ECAs, and charter schools. A number of states have these programs, school vouchers, 14 states, tax credit scholarships, so applying tax credits, being allowed tax credits on your state income tax for private school expenditures, educational savings accounts, which give a little bit more flexibility. Vouchers, I'll make a distinction between vouchers and I think educational savings accounts, which are kind of, I think, the two most active now in terms of where we're headed in this. Educational vouchers are for private school tuition. Educational savings accounts, which really arose in the pandemic, are more flexible, would allow for private school tuition, would allow for online materials, would allow for tutoring, for example. So those are kind of the key ones. And then, of course, charter schools, which are privately run kind of through the public school system and quite popular in a number of states.
Thank you, Professor. We will now move on to a series of questions for Ms. Shepard and Mr. Waters. So, Ms. Shepard, why are you against Amendment 2?
Well, hi, everyone. First, I want to say thank you for being here. This is an issue that affects all of us, whether or not you have students in public school. You interact with people who go to public school and who will graduate from public school and work in our communities. So this is not a rural-urban issue. It's not a progressive conservative issue. It's an everybody issue. And so thank you very much for being here and having investment and wanting to learn about it. I appreciate that. I'm Maddie Shepard. I'm the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association. I've only ever had a career involved in public service and education. I taught in several districts across Kentucky. I have a bachelor's in elementary education and a master's in education leadership and a certification in education law. I don't say those things because I think resumes are super important, but it's important that you know who you're hearing from and the people that you can trust when you're hearing these things. So I'll say that I'm opposed to Amendment 2 for several reasons, and here are the ones that I'll highlight. First, 90% of students in Kentucky attend public schools, and 96% of students of color attend public schools. So that's where the funding should be. We educate everyone. The second reason that we should all be opposed to Amendment 2, and why I am as well, is because private schools are largely unaccountable. Private schools don't have to share the same financial accountability. They don't have to share the same learning and teaching and growth accountability with the community in the same way that public schools do. Private schools don't even have an obligation to educate everyone. Private schools can turn students away because they're expensive, because they're difficult, because they don't fit the model. Public schools in Kentucky for hundreds of years have offered the promise and the commitment to try and educate everyone who walks through our doors. And finally, to just reiterate what William Hoyt said, this is a blank check. This is not a proposal for a voucher with a specific number for a specific type of Kentuckian in a specific tax bracket or specific region. We don't know what's being proposed. Kentuckians are being asked to read a constitutional amendment that lists 6 or 7 sections of our Constitution without the language tied to them to know exactly what is proposed to be ignored, and in doing so, are writing a blank check to politicians in Kentucky who for more than decades have historically underfunded public schools and have shown with their actions that public schools are not a priority, that communities in Kentucky and that Kentucky's youth are not a priority. So those are the reasons I'm voting no on Amendment 2. I'd implore you to do the same and tell 50 of your friends to vote no on Amendment 2.
Mr. Waters, why are you for this amendment?
Thank you. I'm here tonight to talk about what I'm for, not what I'm against. I've heard a lot of what Ms. Shepard is against and the teachers' unions are against. They're against this amendment. They're against education freedom for individuals in Kentucky. They're against school choice programs. They're against any different creativity or innovative ideas on education, and they're simply committed to the status quo. Now, it'd be different if we were actually, as Ms. Shepard said, educating everyone. The problem is too many of our kids are not getting educated. We have a majority of our students tonight in Kentucky and in this district in particular who are failing to reach proficiency in key academic areas of reading and math and science. And should be concerning to all of us, and I agree with Ms. Shepard that this does affect all of us in this way when our children don't get the education they need, but they're handed a diploma, and we have our education establishment leaders crowing about how we have a great 90% graduation rate, and yet only 1 in 4 of our black students here are reaching proficiency. I wonder if they're being misled. I wonder if they're expecting that they've been prepared for the future only to find out that they haven't. So this is about opportunities for all Kentuckians, all Kentucky parents, but really this amendment, contrary to what both of these individuals have said, does not create a school choice policy. It doesn't create a voucher or doesn't create a tax credit scholarship. It doesn't create charter schools. It simply allows the legislature to quit looking over their shoulder at what the courts are demanding and start looking ahead to what parents desire and what students need. And when, I didn't interrupt you, and when we have that, then we'll have some opportunity, I think, to put pressure on the public education system to begin educating more of our students. And that's what I want to see happen. Every state that has a robust school choice policy, every state and city, their public education system has been forced to improve. We've tried many things here since CARA. That hasn't happened. It's time for it to happen. We've talked about it for 34 years. We're spending a lot more money. Let's make it happen.
Mi-
Hey, Jim, I did not say that this created a program. I said it allowed the General Assembly to... No, I said it allowed them to discuss them.
Okay, good. We've got that cleared up.
So,
That's a point that needed to be made. It needed to be clear because we're hearing this called the voucher
what I
amendment.
said.
So, okay. Okay.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Mr. Waters, do school choice programs benefit student achievement? Why or why not?
So we find across the country two types of school choice. One are public schools of choice, which Ms. Shepard and her crowd don't want to talk about because they talk about public dollars for public schools, but they don't want public education delivered in any different way in that. And public charter schools deliver public education in a different way, in a more innovative way. And so that is an option that we know is working well when compared to public education performance. Public charter schools across the country, particularly low-income minority students, are benefiting from this public option and from being able to have a public option. Now, I'm sorry. And so we want parents to have an option that fits their child best, whether that's a public charter school or whether that's a private school option. And if parents are satisfied with the education their children are receiving, then that is the greatest accountability that we can have. I find it really ironic that we hear a lot of talk up here already about accountability. Where is the accountability tonight for the fact that Kentucky has increased per pupil funding by over 125% since the Kentucky Education Reform Act was created, and yet the test scores and results, the educational outputs, are pretty much the same as they were, and the academic achievement gaps are wider than they were when CARA was passed, along with the largest tax increase in Kentucky's history. So I've heard no solutions tonight about how to close those gaps. I haven't heard any solutions from opponents of this amendment on anything about how to address our education problems. It'd be nice to hear what you're for instead of what you're against. Thank you.
Ms. Shepard, same question. do school choice programs benefit student achievement? Why or why not?
That is a great segue, Jim, because I want to start with talking about what we're for. Teachers, parents, community members alike, members of our statewide coalition in Protect Our Schools Kentucky, are for fully resourcing the schools that need the resourcing. We're for accountability systems that honor all the things that public schools do. What a lot of people in the public don't yet understand, because of the way that our accountability scores are communicated, is that all that we're measuring are how students are compared against each other. What we're not measuring are the resources that schools are able to outfit communities with. We're not measuring parent involvement. We're not measuring growth adequately. There are all kinds of things and roles that schools play in communities that are not communicated in accountability scores. And I will say that we have our JCTA and teachers across Kentucky have a lot of hope and optimism for the Kentucky United We Learn Council, which is a part of the Kentucky Department of Education's proposal for how to reimagine and totally reform the way that we capture and communicate learning in Kentucky. What's being proposed is to move us to a model where we communicate more often with the community, and that we capture all the things that we value that schools do and that learners can do when they're ready to leave our schools. So this is a more comprehensive way to capture and communicate learning, and it's something we're really excited about. I do want to address, because I'm a social studies teacher, what was said about the legislature not having to look over their shoulders. Another phrase for that that's in the textbooks that students see in 4th and 5th grade are checks and balances. That's exactly how the government is supposed to work. When the legislature passes something that our Constitution, that has stood for hundreds of years, violates, it is up to the judicial system to strike that down. So this is our government system at work. On the next question, I'll use some of my time to answer the question and debunk some of the per pupil funding misinformation that's been shared.
Ms. Shepard, we'll start with you for this next question, which is, could a school choice program harm Kentucky's public education system, including by taking away money? If so, how or why not?
All right, so there's a lot to unpack here. So I'll first start by responding to the previous question about accountability. The truth is that there's no way to know how accountability compares between private and public schools, because the measures are not the same. Do you see scores in the Courier-Journal from your private schools about how they're doing on Kentucky accountability assessments? You don't. Do you know how they're doing on meeting the needs of our ADA students or students that have IEPs that require services per federal law? You don't. There's a lot of information that the public does not have and does not have access to gain because private schools aren't held to the same accountability measures. On the per pupil funding point, per pupil funding on paper does look like it's the most it's ever been. And monetarily, mathematically, that's true. The reason that's true is because the state legislature has negated to make payments on Kentucky public pensions that the working class has earned in their public service positions. And so those inflated numbers are debt payments from the payments that the politicians in Frankfurt did not put in to the bank accounts that then go out to pay our public servants. And finally, on will this harm students? Absolutely. We've seen in the past that the education budget is in control of the legislature. They're not going to increase the education budget because of this program. We can see that from past behavior. Simple math dictates that if there are more mouths to feed, if there are more places to spend money, the places that receive that money will get less. The amount of education funding we have available in our budget is finite. If we are spreading that out amongst more receivers, public and private schools that charge their attendees in Louisville $29,000 a year to then take our taxpayer funding, of course we're going to suffer. Public schools will have less money to educate the students that walk in our door every day that we promise we will educate.
Mr. Waters, same question as I asked Ms. Shepard. Could a school choice program harm Kentucky's public education system, including by taking away money? If so, how or why not?
So I want to thank our legislature for stepping up and passing some school choice opportunities for parents, trying to help parents. I heard what you're for. I didn't hear a lot about what you're for when it comes to students. I heard a lot about the system. I heard a lot about the adults. I didn't hear a whole lot about students and giving them the education that they need. Because Kentucky doesn't have any school choice programs right now, we can look at other states to see what has happened there. In 1990, when the Kentucky Education Reform Act passed, the state of Florida trailed Kentucky in many key academic areas of math and science and reading. Today, Florida's public education system is at the top of the nation, and they have spent less getting there in that time than we have increased spending here to stay pretty much stagnant and stay pretty much the same. And so what is the difference between the two states? Today, there are about 500,000 students in Florida who are getting an educational opportunity because of school choice programs, whether that's public charter schools or private opportunities or a lot of opportunities for learning disabled children. And that's the major difference. So here we have a state that's expanded choices for parents, and at the same time, its public education system has increased its educational outputs and actually benefiting students. More students getting educated and more students being prepared for the future. And so, you know, you say you're for parents, but how can you be for parents when during the COVID shutdown, it was the unions who convinced the Jefferson County School Board here to keep the schools closed, even after the CDC said it's safe for them to return. And parents said, we want our kids back in school. The fact is, if we would have had school choice programs at that time, parents would have had an opportunity. They would have had an opportunity and a choice. And I'll bet you when they have that, I bet the school board will listen more closely to what the parents have to say. Right now, what motivation do they really have to listen to what parents say here in Jefferson County? Until the parents can make decisions about where their children go to school and how they learn, I don't think that motivation is going to be there. We see that in other states.
Professor Hoyt, this next question is for you. Based on your knowledge of other school systems, what have you seen in terms of funding for school choice and the impact on public education funding?
Yeah, well, I think that rather than talk so much about other school systems, I think there's something that has to be understood with sort of the budgetary impacts. It's pretty easy to illustrate. Actually, I go back to something I wrote 25 years ago about this. What you have to understand about this is that these vouchers are going to be much less than the cost of educating a student in the public schools. And so what that means is that you've got a trade-off here. If you have a voucher that's going to apply to students who are currently in private schools, okay, not all states do that. Some require you to be a public and then leave the public to go to private. Indiana, for example. All right, but let's think otherwise, that you've got those ones who are already in private schools and you're going to pay for them. Okay, then you got a voucher. They'll get the voucher. Then you've got the possibility that others will move into the private schools for a voucher, say, of $5,000 instead of paying, say, $12,000 in public school cost for them. We can debate that. All right, and so if there's a trade-off between the two. And so what's critical is how many move from public schools to private. If enough move and reduce public school costs, you can actually reduce the budgetary impact. The amount that of students that have moved so far in other states has been minimal. For the most part, it's pretty small. And so we probably aren't at that level, but it is certainly a possibility, a real possibility.
Mr. Waters, we will start this next question with you. So the issue of accountability has been raised repeatedly regarding this amendment. If public money were to be approved for private schools, do you think they should be held to similar testing and reporting standards as public schools? Yes or no, and why?
So with private school programs, where the money goes is decided by the parents. If they're not happy with what that school is doing, or that school isn't giving them the information they need, then it's up to them to make that decision. Who left you in charge of what happens at a private school? It's their decision, and they should be the ones to make it. If they're unsatisfied with the way that school is performing in any way, and they're unsatisfied with the information they're getting from that school, what they do, their response is to take their children and put them in a different school. That's the greatest accountability that you can have. And that's the difference in public charter schools and schools. That's the difference in yes, but here's the difference. Okay, all right, here's the difference. The difference is, the difference is that there are parents who cannot afford to do that without financial help. And so unless you're going to say, hey, we're for choice, we're for helping parents, but don't ask us to pay for that, that doesn't sound like a good progressive to me anyhow. We should be open to helping parents provide the best education for their children. And let me say this, whether a child gets the education at a public school, a public charter school, or a private school, if they get the education they need, then the money has been properly used. It is proper use of the money. And really, this is not about funding schools. That's the way that it was phrased, but this is about funding students, not schools and not systems. I mean, when somebody uses Medicare dollars, those dollars, we don't say those dollars belong to the hospital they went to or to the healthcare provider they went to. We say those are public dollars, and we give the individual the dignity of making the decision of where they spend those dollars, whether it's a Medicare program or a GI Bill or Section 8 housing or WIC program. They can spend those dollars where they choose, where they feel they're going to get the most benefit from it. And that's what we're asking for our education system, that parents be put in charge of their children's education once again.
Ms. Shepherd, same question.
Jim, was that a yes or a no?
I answered the question like I'm going to answer.
Okay.
I'm done.
So before I get into answering that question, just a couple pieces of information around parent advocacy. In a public school system, parents can run for the site-based decision-making committee, which make decisions about all kinds of daily things that happen in schools. They even hire the principals. I don't know any private school that involves parents in that way. If parents are upset with their public school district, they can call their board member. They can vote them out. They can speak at a board meeting. Parents have far more agency and power in a public school system. Next, I'll reiterate something that Bill Hoyt shared, which is that what we're seeing in states that have voucher systems, like what is likely to happen in Kentucky should this pass, is that students are not leaving public schools in droves. In fact, in some of the worst offenders, a state that Jim has mentioned in Florida, 69% of users of state vouchers were already in private schools. It's worse in Wisconsin. 75% of users of vouchers were already in private schools. And finally, the worst offender in New Hampshire, 89% of students using state tax dollars to provide a voucher to their school were already in private schools. So to feign that this allows for, some magical opportunity for families that couldn't afford in Louisville on the low end $9,000 and on the high end $29,000 with a $4,000 to $5,000 voucher just doesn't mathematically match up. And then finally, I will address the public accountability piece. Yes, anyone that receives public money should be held accountable to the public.
This next question is for Professor Hoyt. Professor, Based on your knowledge of other states, who uses school choice programs and has the demographic changed throughout the years?
Yeah, thank you. So, in terms of school choice programs, it depends a lot on terms of the structure of, say, the voucher, or the educational savings account. Initially, particularly for vouchers, they tended to be limited in terms of income, their maximum income they would be eligible for, that would be eligible for it, so that was lower income. Some were for what is called an IEP, right, an individual education program, and they were special, what we might think of as special needs students. So again, so that's what it has traditionally been. It has started to evolve to what we call more universal, which everyone is going to apply. And in that case, then we tend to see, because private school student families tend to be higher income, you'll see more of the vouchers being applied to them in these programs that are universal. And that tends to be more of the educational savings account ones, where you have more flexibility. So a lot depends on the programs, and there has been this evolution towards more of a universal program recently, where you can expect to have a broader swath of income using it than the early programs, which were mainly income tested. Indiana is an example. It still has an income tested one. There are several others as well.
Thank you. Ms. Shepard, this next question is for you. So those in favor of Amendment 2 have said it would benefit low-income students, students of color, and those with special needs. What is your response to that viewpoint?
Okay. First, before answering that question, I think we can all agree, and we saw an experience through the pandemic, the most important thing in determining a student's outcome, other than their socioeconomic status, are the teachers that they experience. We all can think of a teacher that had a profound impact on us and changed our lives. And the fact of the matter is that the better we pay our teachers, the more we can attract them, the more we can retain them, the more we can attract the top-notch educators that are out there in the world to be in front of Kentucky's most precious thing, our students, our young people. And in states that have universal vouchers, that Bill Hoyt said are gaining a lot of steam, teachers are historically paid less in those states than states with no vouchers. We're talking states without vouchers, Kentucky teachers make an average of $76,000 per year, and in states with universal vouchers, teachers are making about $58,000. That's a stark annual difference. And so we're not able to recruit the best of the best to get in front of Kentucky's students. That's what the data shows, if we have programs like this. The math just doesn't math. To answer the question, will this help low-income students? Who's to say? We have no way to know, because there's no data out there comprehensively that private schools have to post to show accountability for the growth that they're achieving. A lot of our low-income students are also students that public schools are labeled our gap group, students that require extra services. They might come from countries where they're bilingual, but they haven't learned English yet, and so they require multilingual services. They might have ADA issues that we've got to meet, and we promise that we will. They might have an individual education plan that a public school promises to address. There is no data out there where we're able to compare apples to apples and see if private schools are actually meeting these needs and producing growth. So there's no way for anyone to answer that question, unfortunately.
Mr. Waters, do you think school choice programs should target these specific students, low income, students of color, and those with special needs exclusively? Why or why not?
And I would like to say public charter schools would have to abide by the same accountability that traditional public schools would. So I want to make that clear. But those are public schools that deliver education differently than the traditional public school, and they're schools of choice. They're schools that parents choose. And so there is the same requirement to be subject to the open records and open meetings laws in every public charter school law in the country, and that would be the anticipation here. And then when you talk about whether this would benefit students. I think it would. It just depends, and I want to go back to what Ms. Shepard said. Every student is different. Every child learns differently, and so that's the whole point of expanding options for parents, so that parents will have more opportunity to get the education that best fits their child. And we're seeing around the country that 58% of students in public charter schools, and that's not an insignificant number. We've got over 3.5 million students in public charter schools right now, 8,000 charter schools across the country. A majority of them are from low-income minority homes, and they're getting the opportunity to get an education that best fits their needs. And maybe it is that that school provides certain services they need. We see some great things happening. There's the Tapestry Charter School out in DeKalb County, Georgia, that is actually marketing and reaching out to learning disabled students, inviting them to become part of a school where they learn right along with kids that don't have an IEP. They're showing that it can be done. And so I don't know why there's all this resistance to allowing more individualized. I mean, does anybody here really think that any school, public, private, charter, otherwise, is the best fit for every child? And so why wouldn't we want to give a parent the opportunity to get something that their children need? And we heard the numbers are pretty low compared to the overall numbers in public education. The numbers of people participating and families participating in these programs in other states is very low. It's around 3 to 6% in most cases. Some programs have up to 20%. But still, that's low. And then you take what Professor Hoyt said about the lower cost of vouchers. That's a savings. That's saving taxpayer dollars. That's saving on education dollars, because a lot of these schools are educating kids at half the cost of what the traditional public schools are.
Ms. Shepard, this next question is for you. There are persistent achievement gaps between white and black students and low-income students in the public school system. Why not give the families of struggling students the option of potentially going to private or charter schools per Amendment 2?
All right. So, like I've done before, I'll respond to some other things and I'll get to this question. I want to be really clear. We are not talking about charter schools. The state legislature passed legislation that would allow for vouchers in Kentucky already. Our checks and balances worked. It violated the Constitution. It was struck down unanimously by the Kentucky Supreme Court, citing the 7 sections that are now the legislature is proposing that we ignore. So let's be really clear. This is about the legislature trying to get around the checks and balances that have worked in our Constitution for hundreds of years. And then I also want to challenge the framing of the question. The question assumes that allowing students to leave public schools and go to private schools is a solution. It isn't. The real truth here, when we use, the words that the yes side is using, is that families don't get to choose. Private schools get to choose. Private schools get to choose who attends their schools. So to pretend like private schools are automatically going to accept students that have unique requirements across the board just isn't true. There are students in JCPS that cost us over $100,000 to educate, and we're happy to do that. These are students that are nonverbal, that will never be independent for the rest of their life, that are confined to wheelchairs because of a myriad of ailments. We accept them with open arms. And to be honest with you, I tried to find data in preparation for this forum tonight on the types of students that Trinity and St. X and Sacred Heart educate that are commensurate to our students like that in JCPS. And the data isn't out there. So there's no way for me to say, do these schools offer the same services and support to students that need it that public schools do? There's no way to know that. And so to feign that leaving public schools and automatically getting accepted into a private school is the answer and an actual option is just not true.
Mr. Waters, is there evidence that school choice
Could you start again? I couldn't hear. Thanks.
Is there evidence that school choice programs reduce achievement gaps? Please elaborate.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question, and I think it's important, and the answer is yes. When you look, let's go back to Florida again, and you look at what's happening there with low-income minority students. It's really amazing. There are many low-income minority students, particularly African-American students, who are now outperforming in a charter school, are now outperforming their peers, their black peers, in the traditional public schools. It's in the data from the Florida Department of Education. By the way, I didn't hear any data about the teachers' pay and the gap there. What we do have on our website is some research showing that where there are school choice programs, that pushes teachers' pay up across the board in public schools, in private schools, and in charter schools. Well, bring me the data that says otherwise. I don't care about your emotion, but bring me the data, bring me the facts. And the facts are, I'm talking about the facts. I'm talking about the facts, and the facts are,
Everyone, we are here to have a discussion tonight, and we would like to give all our panelists the respect to be able to respond to these questions. So please.
That doesn't count toward my time, I hope. But it's amazing, truly, what we're seeing in other places. And I think we have to get past this thing. If we didn't think of the idea here, it must not be a good idea. I think it's harmful to our students that need something different. Now, if you're going to say that none of our students need anything different, and yet a majority of our students are not reaching proficiency in key academic areas, then you're free to believe that. But I don't think most reasonable people, no matter where you stand on this amendment, would believe that. And this amendment doesn't determine what kinds of programs we're going to have, but it does allow us to say that the status quo is not acceptable for too many children, and we need to offer them some ideas. And by the way, the court used the same argument, the opponents in court used the same argument on the charter school bill. You didn't hear Ms. Shepard mention that at all. House Bill 9 is going to be heard by the Kentucky Supreme Court. The opponents of this amendment, don't you find it interesting? They don't want to talk about charter schools because that's public education, but it's being delivered in a different way, and where it's happening in 45 states across America, it is helping close gaps. Now, if you're going to say that all the parents who want to take advantage of these school choice programs, that they don't care enough about their kids to get them in the best school, be my guest. But that's not my view. My view is that parents care deeply about what kind of education their children get, and if they're not going to get it in one place, they're going to look for another place to get it. If I'm a black parent in Florida, I'm really happy right now if my child is outperforming black students in the traditional public schools because they're on their way to success in their academic careers and in life.
Ms. Shepard, we'll start this next question with you. So do you see Amendment 2 having an impact on teacher salaries? If so, in what way?
Sure. So first, to unpack a little bit of the information that's out there in Florida. What is also happening in Florida, in addition to the existence of voucher schemes, are record investments, more than hundreds of billions of dollars that Florida public schools have now had access to from the federal government. So of course, more money for more teachers, for smaller class sizes, for one-on-one attention is going to result in better learning. That's what we're advocating for here too. We'd love for the legislature to give us the money that they're statutorily required to for transportation so that we don't have to use our funding for that. We'd love to have a teacher in every classroom and a bus driver on every bus because we know that's what results in learning outcomes for students. Next, I'll say around teacher salaries. Just back to the budget question. Our budget is finite. What Kentucky taxpayers are able to contribute to our state budget is finite. And what the legislature decides of that total budget is going to be used for education is finite. If right now, JCPS, for example, educates 80% of students in Louisville, but because of the way that the Constitution is written and has stood for over 100 years, the 80% of students receive 100% of state funding. if a voucher scheme like this were to occur, now 100% of students are going to receive that funding. That's less money for more students. If you have less money in your bank account, of course you can't afford to pay teachers what they need to be paid to stay, to be recruited, and attract the best of the best. It's a really simple mathematical equation that's been inflated and misinformed by many proponents for Amendment 2.
Mr. Waters, the same question. Do you see Amendment 2 having an impact on teacher salaries? If so, in what way?
Well, Amendment 2 is not directly going to create any policy, and I think that's an important constitutional lesson here if you want to talk about checks and balances. It's the legislature that creates policy. There doesn't seem to be much support for them here among the folks who are opposed to this amendment tonight, but the fact is they're charged with, by the Constitution, with creating policy. And so that policy isn't created at the ballot box. It's this is to remove a legal barrier so that they can create the best policies for our state. And so that's a big difference, I think, in this. Ms. Shepherd talked about the record investments that were made in Florida. We've made some pretty big investments here, and they're not recognized because they don't fit the narrative of that our public education system is underfunded. But the fact is, in 1990, when CARA was passed, we funded students at about $10,000 per pupil in today's dollars. Today, we're funding them at over $20,000 per pupil. If we have a voucher that is $7,500 or a scholarship, why don't the opponents of this, why don't you acknowledge that there's quite a bit of savings there if a school takes $7,500 and provides a student with a first-rate education and they get what they need? Why is that so bad? I mean, the public education system is still going to receive the property tax dollars, a lot of the federal dollars that they receive. And by the way, I want to thank our legislators for increasing funding to education in these recent budgets, where they have not only sent the SEEK dollars, but on top of that, they have sent one lump sum funding, if you will, to local districts to do with as they please. And I wish you all could understand that teachers don't work for the state. They work for their local district. So it's up to the local district to give raises and to compensate teachers according to their salary schedules. That's not something that the state does. That's something local districts do, and our legislators have sent them the funding saying, you're welcome to use this for that, and we encourage you to do so.
Mr. Waters, we'll start this question with you, and this will be our last question in our prepared questions before we move on to the audience questions that people have submitted. So Mr. Waters, charter schools are already legal in Kentucky, but lack a funding mechanism, which is why they haven't opened. If Amendment 2 passes, would you support Kentucky funding charter schools?
Yes, I think we would. And I've given you reasons why, though. I'm not just saying that, I'm not pulling that answer out of some random answer tonight. I've given you some pretty good indication about why I believe that charter schools should be funded here. The main reason, though, is because I don't see anything that we have done here in 34 years since CARA. How many generations of students is that? How many students is that? I haven't seen any of the experiments. I haven't seen the record funding that we put in when we created CARA. We instituted a $1 billion tax increase when we passed CARA. It's the largest tax increase in Kentucky's history. What I hear from the other side is just put more money on this and it'll solve the problem. I challenge anyone here tonight to bring me evidence that more money automatically results in a better education system. The state of Florida has increased funding, but I'm talking about the increases now since CARA. They have not increased funding as much as Kentucky has, and yet they're getting much better results. And by the way, I want to commend you all for finally being concerned and saying that resources are finite, because the only thing we ever hear in Frankfurt about public education is more money, please. You're not funding us properly. And yet, we're sitting in a school district tonight that has a $2.2 billion budget. There's no way that parents in this district ought to have to reach into their own pockets to buy supplies and things that are needed for their classroom with a budget that's twice the size of the Louisville Metro Council. You want to talk about accountability and transparency, where is that money going?
Ms. Shepard, same question to you. If Amendment 2 passes, would you support Kentucky funding charter schools?
Sure. So we're not talking about charter schools, to reiterate a previous answer. All we need to do is look at the writing on the wall. The politicians in Frankfurt passed legislation that allowed for vouchers. The Kentucky Constitution doesn't allow for that. And so our checks and balances were enacted, and the Kentucky Supreme Court unanimously struck down that legislation. This amendment is a response to that directly. This is not about charter schools. I'll use the rest of my time to debunk some of the per pupil funding misinformation. Yes, JCPS, which is the largest district in Kentucky and educates almost 100,000 students, does have a multi-billion-dollar budget. It is commensurate in per pupil funding to Fayette County, to Estill County, and to districts in northern Kentucky. So we educate more students. Our budget is larger. It's a simple mathematical equation. What is not as simple, though, is unpacking that per pupil funding. When a person looks at that per pupil funding and sees $20,000 on paper, what they don't see is that broken down. What they don't see is that $20,000 includes capital funding to build schools, to repair HVACs that, again, support 100,000 students. What's also not a part of the unpacking of that number are pensions. In JCPS, 1/6 of the per pupil funding is spent on pensions. And that number looks inflated, again, because the legislature chose not to pay public pensions that they are statutorily, legally required to pay. These public servants have master's degrees and walk into our public schools every day to educate our most under-resourced students and make far less than other people in other industries with the same amount of education, are educating our students, and the pensions that they have rightfully earned, our legislature chose not to pay. And so part of that $20,000 are debt payments that should never have been created because the legislature and politicians in Frankfurt chose not to pay the pensions of public servants that already earned them.
These are education costs. These are costs related to educating our children. Those are figured into the per pupil funding. So unless you would rather us not fund pensions or not fund benefits for teachers, then we don't have to count that. But that's part of their compensation. How can you say that that's not part of their compensation? And then this legislature did not do that to the pensions. Those were previous lawmakers who used the pension system for political gain to offer benefits at levels we could not afford. It caught up with us, and that's why we have unfunded liabilities, and this legislature is trying to make that right. But if they would have funded those along, that would have just increased our per pupil funding in earlier years, because that's part of our cost of educating students. So I don't see that that's a really big issue, because it was going to have to be done anyhow, unless you want to just deny that we're spending over $20,000 per pupil. But still, let's just say we were spending $16,000 or $15,000. Still, a voucher program, still a scholarship program is only half of that cost.
It's intellectually disingenuous to represent that funding that is statutorily required like it's some kind of special record investment.
We need to move on
Why is that
to our
dishonest?
audience questions to make sure we have enough time.
It's part of it.
We'll be moving on to the audience questions right now. So we reviewed the audience questions, and we'll fit as many as we can during the allotted time. We wanted to address that some of these questions ask specifically about what a specific voucher program would look like in Kentucky, such as who would qualify and what the average voucher value would be. If the amendment passes and the General Assembly were to introduce a voucher program, those answers and decisions would be left up to the lawmakers, such as the qualifications and allocation for funding. The first question that I have is for Professor Hoyt. Would you be able to explain what the notwithstanding section of the amendment means?
The notwithstanding, I guess I'm not quite sure about what's being referred to here. Is this section what?
The part of the amendment that says,
Notwithstanding.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, so the General Assembly exercised this authority by law, sections, the sixth section of this Constitution notwithstanding. Yeah, and so as I mentioned in my earlier comments, that these are referring to sections that now limit, as interpreted, funding strictly to public schools. So the notwithstanding refers to notwithstanding those ones that are interpreted as restricting it.
This next question that we have from the audience, we'll start with Mr. Waters for it. So if there is a voucher program, what is there to stop the schools from simply increasing their tuition by the same amount as the voucher?
What schools? Private schools? So if parents cannot afford a private school, they won't choose it. And there's a lot of incentive. And there's an incentive there for schools to keep their costs and work with parents, to work with them on educating their students. And we're finding across the country that now you mentioned the opposition always mentions the higher cost schools here, and we do have some higher cost private schools, but there are many private schools who will work with parents and work with their resources to figure out a way to educate their students, because for most of them, the focus, I'm sorry, go ahead. So maybe I could finish.
Everyone, please let's keep this conversation civil.
Thank you. But we're finding that private schools' focus is not a system. It's the students. They're not in the system. So they have the ability and flexibility to work with students and to help educate them and work with parents on what their resources are. We've heard a lot of wonderful stories here. And here, in fact, right here in Louisville, the school choice scholarship programs a few years ago, when that program at its highest level of participation, they had about 6,000 students on a waiting list. And this was just a group raising money privately to give scholarships. And to qualify, you had to be below the free and reduced lunch line. You had to be really low income because there were so many families wanting to take advantage of this. And at the highest level of participation, it still had a documented need of $20 million beyond what they were able to distribute. And so I propose tonight, would you accept that we have a school choice program, a tax credit scholarship program, and for the students, low-income students who are in the 15% of the lowest performing schools, would you agree that we could have a program for them where their parents could take those dollars and take them to a school that works better for them? That is, low-income students in the lowest 15% performing schools in our state. Would you agree to that? And if not, why not?
Thank you, Mr. Waters and Ms. Shepherd. Before I let you respond, just to remind, we will allow 2 minutes for each response, similar to what we've done with the prepared questions. And Bailey, our government editor, will be holding up the pen. Okay, Ms. Shepherd, the same question to you. What is there to stop schools from simply increasing their tuition by the same amount as the voucher?
Nothing. The truth is that all we have to look at in trying to determine what Kentucky is going to do, because like has been stated, I think by all three of us, the politicians in Frankfort have not laid out a plan. We don't know how much the vouchers are going to cost. We don't know who they're going to be available to. We don't know what type of hit our budget at large, let alone our education budget, is going to take. And so we don't know, how the state's going to respond, but we can guess based on what other states have done. Let's look at Indiana and Ohio, for example. Indiana and Ohio offer vouchers at $5,500 and $5,800 respectively. Private schools in Louisville, just because that's where we are, range from $9,000 to $29,000. If the intent of this amendment is to offer families the option to attend a $29,000 or even a $9,000 school with a $5,500 voucher, this does not accomplish that intent. And we see that in the numbers from other states that I stated before. In New Hampshire, 89% of students using these vouchers and families using these vouchers were already in private schools. So this is not accomplishing the proposed intent. It simply isn't. What it is accomplishing is subsidizing private school costs for families that already are using it and can already afford it. And then, was that 30 seconds or time? 30 seconds. So the last thing I'll say is that we don't really know what vouchers will look like. I'll elaborate on what Professor Hoyt said. But we are being asked to trust politicians in Frankfort that have underfunded transportation and underfunded our pensions for almost 20 years. So it would be naive to think that funding is going to stay the same if a voucher scheme is passed.
Ms. Shepard, we'll start this next question with you, which is, there are dozens of Kentucky counties with no private schools. How would this amendment affect rural counties specifically?
Ooh, that's a great question. Like I opened with before, this is not a rural-urban issue. This is not a progressive conservative issue. This is an everybody issue. And in Louisville, what a voucher scheme would mean is that public schools that educate our most under-resourced students and families are going to lose money. What it means in rural counties, in more than 60% of Kentucky counties that don't even have access to a private school in which to use this voucher, that means that their tax dollars are going to be taken and sent to someone else to use, not in their school district, to send to a private school. And I'll just share some economic information that it's not like this in Louisville, and so we don't always think about this, but out in the state, in Estill County, in Whitesburg, in Pulaski County, the school system is the single largest employer of people in those districts. And so if those school districts, if those employers lose funding because the state education budget takes a hit, that means the economy in those rural counties is going to suffer. And that's something that we should all be concerned about.
Mr. Waters, the same question.
So it's unusual to hear that freedom will hurt counties, freedom for individuals, freedom for parents. If I want to go back for just 1 second to a previous statement. If the cost of attending a private school was too high for a family, then they just wouldn't be able to do it. So why would you oppose allowing that for those families, few families that may be able to do that? And by the way, just because somebody's already in a private school doesn't mean they're wealthy. We know a lot of Kentuckians tonight who are sacrificing greatly to put their children in a school that works better for them. In Jackson County, Kentucky, rural county, we're spending over $23,000 per pupil. 8% of the 8th graders in that district can do math proficiently. Not many more can do reading. There are 2 private schools in that county. They're small, but the parents have said if we had the option of a scholarship or a voucher, we know that there are people who would take advantage of that. But more importantly, I think we would see that 8% go up pretty quickly, because there would be a lot of motivation to quit pointing fingers and start getting the job done when it comes to closing gaps and providing a better education for our children. I've heard a lot about the system, a lot about money, a lot about the adults, but I haven't heard as much about what we're going to do to help our students. And I want to say one more time, this legislature that's now in power did not create those pension problems. They have tried to fix them, and I think they deserve our thanks for that. I've been as willing to criticize the legislature as anybody in this state, but the fact that they've done this and put millions of dollars into that is an indication that they're serious about trying to fix this problem. Thank you.
Mr. Waters, we'll start this question with you then. So this question is, what accountability will parents and taxpayers have to gauge a charter or private school's performance?
So with charter schools, they have what's called a charter, and House Bill 9 would have required that applicants to create a charter school would have a business plan, including for facilities, for transportation, what kind of school are they going to be. And each charter school is autonomous, so it has its own board, but it has a charter that it abides by. And in that charter, it says, here is what we'll do in exchange for the flexibility and innovation that we have as a charter school. We will perform at this level. And so they can be held accountable for what they promise to do. And I promise you, I want the most rigorous charter school policy that we can have. We do not want to create more failing schools. We want these schools to be successful and to be rigorous. But we have a problem with that because we have school districts in Kentucky that passed resolutions saying they were opposed even to the idea of charter schools even before a bill was passed. What chance do you think there is that that school board is going to approve a charter school, no matter how good the plan is? We need to make sure that that's fixed. And then the other part of the question was about non-public schools, and the question was what again?
How would the public be able to gauge in accountability,
Okay.
such as test scores and student
Well,
performance?
if parents aren't satisfied with what's going on in a private school, they'll close. If St. X closed because parents said, hey, they're no longer providing the education that our children need, I don't know why you're laughing, because I think that's a pretty serious idea. I think it's a serious idea that it's parents who make the decision about whether a school's working. And if it isn't working, that's the great thing about choice. They remove their children, and that school doesn't get that funding. And if enough parents do that, that school closes, or they have to get their act together, just like the public education system does. A rising tide lifts all boats. That's what I want to see. I want to see a better education system, not either or, not either public education or choice, but both and, both a strong public education system and educational freedom for parents. This is Kentucky. This is America. Freedom fits. Thank you.
Ms. Shepard, the same question. What accountability will parents and taxpayers have to gauge a charter or private school performance?
So I've spent my entire professional career as a public servant in public schools. I started my career in a rural elementary school. That rural elementary school, per this amendment, would not have the freedom to access private schools if this were to pass, because they don't exist. More than 60% of counties in Kentucky are in the same boat. So this is about freedom, and many Kentuckians are going to lose the freedom to have their tax dollars fund a system that they themselves have access to. Additionally, what our Constitution offers is a promise to every Kentuckian to have the freedom to access a great public school. Public schools educate every student that walks in our door, and we won't have the ability to do that to the levels that we have now or that we hope to if that funding goes away. Funding is finite. If that funding is spent on private schools where parents, again, are paying $9,000 to $29,000 a year in tuition, that freedom will be eroded. We won't have the public school quality that we have now. We won't be able to hope for or build towards something better. And this is why many, many legislators voted against the passage of this amendment and putting it on the ballot to begin with. Republicans and Democrats alike. More than 30 Republicans voted against this because out in rural areas, they know that their constituents won't have access to this. They won't have the same freedoms that people in urban areas like Northern Kentucky or Lexington or Louisville have. So again, this is not a progressive conservative issue. This isn't a rural urban issue. This is bad for everyone.
12 Republicans voted against this. 12. And by the way, if we have a school choice program, it will create opportunities. We'll see more schools created, more good schools.
We're
So let's
gonna-
get our facts straight here. 12 Republicans voted against this, not 30. 12. Thank you.
We're going to move on to the next question, and I'll start with you, Ms. Shepard, for this one, which is how are educational options offered through vouchers better/different from those available in the academics that
The biggest difference I can talk about is that the magnet programs that exist in public schools, again, are open to everyone. Private schools get to choose who they educate. Private schools can say, you don't fit. They can say you don't fit when you apply. They can say you don't fit on October 10th when they have the funding from the state, and then you're sent back to a public school. And on the point of, parents holding schools accountable by simply withdrawing their students or closing a school, that's not a flippant decision. These are adverse experiences that affect young adults for the rest of their lives. So to flippantly say that, oh, we'll just close a school or, oh, they'll just pull them out, this is a big deal for our youth. And we shouldn't be acting like it's something that, we can just do daily if we're unhappy with something happening in private schools. What I can say is that public schools don't do that. Public schools don't turn students away. Public schools won't tell you we can't educate you because you're not the right fit, but we are going to keep the money from the tax dollars that came in with you because now it's October 10th and we get to keep it. Public schools aren't going to do that.
Mr. Waters, the same question.
I think it is a very serious decision. And I think it's flippant to say that we need to keep students in a school that doesn't best fit their need because we need the money that they bring. That's a serious problem. I think with a school choice program in Kentucky that provided a $6,000 to $8,000 account of some kind, education savings account, opportunity, whatever, voucher, I think we would see schools created that serve students and that would find the resources, and the resources would be available to help provide that education. We see it in other states, and I don't know why there's any reason that couldn't happen here. So I think, a lot of our students need that. But again, I would ask, would you support a limited school choice program that allows the parents of low-income students in the 15 lowest performing schools in Kentucky to have a voucher or a tax credit scholarship? If not, why not?
Thank you. This next question, we will start with you, Mr. Waters. So this person asks, if Amendment 2 passes, could our taxes be used to fund schools that teach outrageous ideas like the Holocaust didn't happen, slavery was good, and so on?
I mean, I don't get asked that question about critical race theory or some of the other things that are being taught in the public system. But I'm going to answer. I'm going to answer it. And here's the truth is, I'll wait.
Everyone, we have a lot of audience questions and want to get as many as we can this evening.
It's up to a parent in a private school to decide whether that school is fitting their kids' needs. And if you say tonight that most Kentucky parents would be happy with a school that teaches that the earth is flat or the Holocaust didn't happen, then that's a real slap against parents that you have a problem with. And that's where we need to put the power and re-empower parents on making that decision. And by the way, I would much rather a student actually learn to read and be proficient in reading and math and maybe they're taught a few loony ideas, but they actually are taught how to read and how to think critically, because they will be able then to decide what they believe when they leave school. I trust the parents, and I trust the kids that will grow up in that situation. They can make the decision. If you can't read, you certainly can't make those kind of decisions. And over half of our students in the public system are not reading proficiently. What are we going to do about that?
Ms. Shepherd, the same question.
It's a really simple answer. There is absolutely nothing that any public entity or government could do to regulate private schools that accept public funding around their curriculum. They could teach whatever they decide to teach, and they'll do it on our dime.
Ms. Shepherd will start this question with you then, which is, this person asks, currently private schools are a privilege and not a right. What happens to the students who are rejected and funding is being diverted?
I'm going to interpret that question to mean what happens when students are rejected from private schools. When students are rejected from private schools, and it happens all the time, because again, private schools don't promise to educate everyone that applies. They'll take your money, but they don't have to educate your student. They'll be turned away. They'll either be turned away when the application is accepted, or they'll be turned away in a couple weeks when the student needs more than the school is willing to spend to provide. So there is no guarantee that private schools will accept the Kentucky students that might bring extra money if a voucher scheme is passed. Absolutely no promise whatsoever.
Mr. Waters.
Funding of schools, I keep hearing this, it's providing parents with the help they need to give their children a better education, whatever school that may happen to be at. By the way, magnet schools do restrict entrance to students. Magnet schools are not charter schools. Every single charter school law in the country, all 45 states, require that charter schools have a first-come, first-served policy. And as happens in many states, there are more parents wanting to get their children into a charter school than there are seats available. In that case, the law spells out that they must have a random lottery. They cannot pick and choose their students. On the other hand, a magnet school, and I'm for magnet schools, I'm for all kinds of choice, but let's not be naive here or uninformed about the difference. A magnet school, we just saw some great reporting by the Courier-Journal recently on how people were doing everything they could, pulling the strings to get their kids in the best magnet schools. I don't blame them at all. I mean, and that tells me right there that parents understand which schools are doing a great job and they want their students to be in there. But magnet schools have admissions process and they have restrictions. Ironically, we have one of the best high schools in the nation here, recognized at the Gatton Academy on the campus of Western Kentucky University. But that is not a charter school. That's a magnet school. You have to be accepted and admitted into that school. In fact, if this amendment doesn't pass, there's going to have to be something done to address all of these schools that we are currently sending public dollars to that, according to the court's definition, are not common schools, like magnet schools, like the Kentucky School for the Blind, the Kentucky School for the Deaf, the Gatton Academies, the Craft Academies. They're all doing a great job, but they don't fit the description of a common public school that the court gave. So what are we going to do about those options? We need all kinds of options here. That's the point. It's both and, not either or. Very important.
Mr. Waters, we'll start this question with you, which is, this person says they believe in choice, but is there any concern that our private schools are not ready to handle students with unique challenges?
I'm sorry, who was that for?
Sorry, Mr. Waters.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was my bad. So we're finding that, first of all, increasingly, we're seeing learning disabled students, students with IEPs and special needs, that are taking advantage of school choice programs. There are some great scholarship programs going on in states like Florida. Even West Virginia now has one that has about 10,000 students that are participating in this, and that's a neighbor of Kentucky. And so what we're finding is that in the school choice programs in some states, learning disabled students are beginning to approach the percentage using those programs as are found in public schools. But look, we have right now public schools, and I think this is a plus for our public education system here, that recognize that parents with special needs children may need a different school. They may need the Summit Academy, or they may need another school that provides services and therapy and whatever that particular student needs, and they will help parents get their children into those schools because they recognize there's not a whole lot of other options for them, and they do care about the students. So if we do, why don't we allow more options, more opportunities? And look, if these programs don't work, and if our public system is doing a good job with every student, what's the harm in allowing a few parents to take advantage of this? If it doesn't work for them, they won't do it.
Ms. Shepherd, the same question.
I'll go back to the previous question, and I just want to be really clear for like the third or fourth time. We're not talking about charter schools. If the legislature wanted to have charter schools, yeah, they do. It's legal. They're allowed. They can open at any time. This amendment isn't needed to enact or build or start a charter school. It is needed for a voucher, because vouchers have been attempted to be passed in Kentucky, and they've been struck down by our court and negated by our Constitution, which has stood for over 100 years. So we are not talking about charters. We are talking about vouchers. The next thing I'll say is that vouchers do not accomplish the advertised intent. They do not offer choice to parents. We're seeing in states that have voucher schemes active all over the place. Arizona, 75% of voucher users were already in private schools. So we are not seeing exoduses of students from public schools that are now taking advantage of this new scheme. The intent might be well-meaning. The voucher scheme does not accomplish that intent. We're seeing that in states everywhere. Next, I'll say the answer to this question is no. There is no data to show that students' needs are being met better in private schools. Why isn't there any data? Because private schools are largely unaccountable. Private schools don't have to tell you how they're meeting needs of students with IEPs. They don't have to post any type of financial accountability in how they're spending money. They don't have to compare apples to apples on state testing numbers to know if students are growing at the same rates. It's impossible for us to say that private schools are better at meeting the needs of students with challenging or unique needs because they're not held to the same data or accountability standards.
We're going to have to move on to our next question because we're almost out of time, and this is for Professor Hoyt. So this person would like to know, are voucher programs in other states need/income based?
The answer is some are. There are a number of good examples. Indiana is one. Wisconsin, which has one of the oldest ones, has one specifically for Milwaukee that is income-based. So there's a number of them, and how much varies. The standard is to look at free or reduced lunch, which standard, and some are 200% of that, which for, say, a family of two would be about $30,000. Some are double that. Some are even 4 times that. So yes, there are income-based ones, as well as sort of special needs types of programs, very narrowly defined.
Since we are running close to time, this will be our last question, and we will start with Mr. Waters, which is Kentucky the only state that doesn't have school choice?
So there are 45 states with charter school laws. There are 33 states that have 80 different programs that are non-public programs, tax credit scholarships, scholarships for learning disabled, vouchers. And so most states have some kind of option. There are a couple of other states that have had school choice programs that are basically public choices with public education because of the population is so spread out. So the fact is that every state surrounding Kentucky has these school choice programs. Every state has charter schools, and to the point that we have a charter school law, that's kind of the incomplete answer. Last year, the court struck down a funding mechanism that would have provided funding for public charter schools, which as public schools should receive public funding as they are public schools. So we see that in all the 7 surrounding states. We have states in America that have had these types of school choice programs since the early 90s, decades of this. So this isn't some new radical idea. If having a voucher program or a tax credit scholarship program was going to cause a public education system in a state to implode, I think after 32 years of school choice programs, we would have seen that happen. But instead, what we're seeing are public education systems who are saying, we better figure this out so we can educate students and so we can compete. And I think that dynamic of competing has caused the tide to rise, and with it, all boats. And there's no reason why here in Kentucky we can't have the greatest school choice program. We can see what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think our legislators will do that. I believe they will. Thank you.
Ms. Shepherd, the same question.
No, we don't have active voucher schemes in Kentucky, and I'm really proud of that. Kentucky has a really rich history of valuing community, valuing public education, valuing our Constitution. And for those reasons, among many others, we don't have any active voucher schemes in Kentucky. And what is an interesting dichotomy is that there is this narrative out there that public schools are failing, when if you talk to most Kentuckians have a lot of pride and trust in their local public school. They go to church with their daughter's 5th grade teacher. They, go to the bar on weekends to play cards with the high school science teacher. Kentuckians have a lot of trust in their communities, in their neighbors, and in their local public school. So the narrative that isn't the case just isn't true. And that's one of the reasons we don't have voucher schemes active in Kentucky. We trust our community members. We trust our neighbors. We don't need a voucher to take our tax dollars away and send them to a private school that some of our Kentucky neighbors don't even have access to.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists for coming out tonight to have this discussion, and I would like to bring up the Courier-Journal's executive editor now, who would like to say a few words.
Hello, and thank you all for attending. Sorry about that. I'm a little bit. There we go. Sorry about that. I wanted to, again, thank Hannah for doing such a wonderful job of moderating this discussion. And again, thank you to our panelists for agreeing to come. I know it's tough to stand in front of a crowd and answer these questions. But at the Courier-Journal, we felt it was important to have a dialogue about what is on what our voters are voting for, and we really do appreciate you taking the time to come. I do not like public speaking, as you can tell. Also, I wanted to recognize Vita Morgan. She's our community engagement editor, and she has done a fantastic job of putting this together. And I also want to let you all know that we received a significant amount of questions tonight that we did not get to. So we're going to take these questions and we're going to answer them and publish them online in the newspaper. As many of them as we can, we will, of course, coordinate these topic matters and try to answer some more of your questions. We really do appreciate you all coming. Thank you.